C is for Contra, that's good enough for me. Hey there, I'm Roger the Retro Gaming Puppet, this is Obscure Old Games, and hey, we're just getting started with our Game Boys of Summer series, and well, there's a new Contra coming out later this year, and it's going to be on Switch, so that makes it technically portable, so what better time to talk about Operation C? Operation C was released in early 1991 by Konami, who had a very friendly relationship with Nintendo at the time. In fact, in the US, Operation C was released under the Ultra Games label, which only existed so Konami could exceed Nintendo of America's limitations on the number of games they could publish annually. The game came hot on the heels of the NES port of Super Contra, called Super C in the US because the term Contra had some interesting baggage in America at the time, with less than a year between Super C and Operation C. In Europe, the game was known as Probotector, which has a whole history of its own, but that was the series' European alias until the 1997 release of Legacy of War on the PS1. Due to certain European countries' aversion to realistic portrayals of violence in video games, the Contra games were altered to have all the characters become robots for that territory. Which brings me to the version you're going to see most here, the color version. This is another thing that could be a whole episode of its own, but late in the system lifespan, Konami put out 4 Game Boy compilation carts with 4 games each. In Japan, they were released in 1997 and all had Super Game Boy features like custom borders and the like. But when the comps made their way to Europe in 2000, Super Game Boy was out and Game Boy Color was in. So they ditched the custom borders and added color to all the games. And since it was so far past the time of the original concern, while the title remains Probotector, the graphics are unchanged from the original version. Sadly, these color compilations never left Europe, and I didn't even know about them until years later. And unfortunately, they're climbing up there in the aftermarket these days, but if you are a Game Boy aficionado, then you should definitely seek them out. Operation C is 5 stages of run and gun action, 3 side-scrolling and 2 top-down like some of the stages in Super C. And it nails the feel of Contra on a handheld without making a lot of the typical mistakes Game Boy games at the time often did. It moves more slowly than Contra or Super C on the NES to handle the blur of the original Game Boy screen, but it doesn't feel like your character's walking in molasses, which another Konami adaptation, Castlevania Adventure, definitely did. Molasses everywhere in that one. Everything is sized correctly here for the Game Boy screen, so there are very few gotchas and you don't really ever feel like your character's too large to navigate the challenges. Also, it seems largely forgotten these days, but Operation C innovated a few things that would become features in later games. First off, you start with a machine gun. While most people probably associate this with Contra 3 on the Super NES, it appeared here first. This game also introduced stackable power-ups, and while this isn't a huge feature throughout the series, one of the best entries, Contra 4, made great use of it, and it first appeared in Operation C, where you can upgrade your spread shot by collecting a second S icon. Sadly, this is a spread-only feature for the game. Finally, this game introduced a favorite weapon of the Contra games, the Hunter, a homing weapon. Later games would revise it to look like missiles, but in this version it's just bullets. Still, the effect is the same. Another feature that seems to hold mindshare with Contra 3, but in fact appeared on the humble Game Boy first. And while we're talking weapons, this game holds the distinction of being the only Contra game I can think of where the spread is the worst power-up in the game. Yeah, there are only 3 power-ups here, but between the Hunter and the Super C style fire power-up, aka the best Contra fire power-up, as the millennial crowd is saying these days, don't at me. The spread just can't compete, especially since you need two of them to get it to full power. Though this is also a game where all the power-ups are at the very least useful, and you really can't truly go wrong with any of them. And honestly, the quality of this game shouldn't come as too much of a surprise when you find out who worked on it. This game only credits 4 people. 2 programmers, a graphics person, and a sound person. One of those programmers? Toru Hagihara, who would go on to direct Castlevania Rondo of Blood for the PC Engine Super CD, among others. And while we're talking credits and Castlevania connections, sound designer Hidehiro Funachi, who would go on to craft the excellent soundtrack to Castlevania II Belmont's Revenge on the Game Boy, does a fantastic job here adapting existing Contra tunes to the Game Boy's stereo hardware. Okay, now with all that said, what's the best way to play the darn thing? If you have a way to play Game Boy Color games, I tend to favor the color version from Konami GB Collection Volume 1. It makes some of the hazards easier to see, and I just like the pop of the colors. But an original standalone cart is a fine way too. The easiest way now, though, is via the just-released Konami Anniversary Collection, available on, well, every modern platform, though we grabbed it for the Switch. Unfortunately, the color version isn't included, but one advantage is that what is included is the Japanese version, which has the stage select for stages 1 through 4 available from the start. The US version had that locked behind the Konami code. Said code gives you 10 lives in the Japanese version, making it just a little easier. But much like eating a Reese's Peanut Butter Cup, there's no wrong way to play Operation C. It's pretty short and on the easy side for a Contra title, at least until the final stage, but it's a bit of a hidden gem for the series, and you'd do well to check it out if you've never played it before, especially now that it's so readily available in the Anniversary Collection. Then yeah, that about does it for me, but I'll be back later in the Game Boys of Summer with an episode of 5 Reasons. And Joe will be back soon with another episode of Same Name, Different Game, so stay tuned. Yeah, I'm Roger the Gaming Puppet, and I'll see you next time, right here on Obscure Old Games. Hey everyone, it's Joe, and thank you so much for watching Roger talk Operation C. If you dig the shows, like, comment, subscribe, share, hit the bell, do all that nonsense. If you really dig the shows, consider helping out on Patreon. You'll get early access to new episodes and have your name listed here among all these fine folks. If you want more Konami, the video on the left is on Castlevania 3, and the one on the right is all about Metal Gear Solid.